Welcome everyone to today's fly-in for the FDA Task Force for Doctors for America. My name is Reshma Ramachandran. I'm the chair of the FDA Task Force.
And I am Terryn. I am the program manager for the FDA Task Force.
And today we're going to be talking about the FDA just generally, specifically around drug and device regulation and why the FDA Task Force for Doctors for America exists, how it came to be, and kind of our theory of change for supporting and strengthening the FDA. So here's the agenda that we have for today. We'll first go talk about the FDA and its huge impact on our clinical practice and our prescribing behavior in our patients. We'll also talk about FDA regulatory standards and the implications it has on patients and public health, the FDA's task force theory of change, and then Terryn will talk about how we're implementing this theory of change for improving and strengthening and supporting the FDA. And then together we'll talk a little bit about our engagement with other organizations too. What is the DFA FDA Task Force? So the DFA FDA Task Force is a working group of clinicians across different specialties within Doctors for America that's advocating for a stronger FDA. And together we're educating legislators, but also other medical professionals, our colleagues, around the importance of having clinical trial diversity, around improving the accelerated approval process, but improving the FDA general regulatory approval process overall. We're the only nonpartisan physician counterweight to the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, and oftentimes one of the few organizations that actually doesn't receive money from the pharmaceutical and medical device industry that's presenting in front of the FDA and also on Congress on regulatory policy issues within this space. So FDA's footprint is huge. FDA regulates every 25 cents of every dollar that's spent. About 70% of every outpatient visit involves some sort of medication, and almost 80% of every hospital ER visit involves some sort of medication therapy. So just on drugs alone, and this does include the many devices that are used in visits outside of just prescription drugs, are also regulated by the FDA. The percentage of people that are also using at least one prescription drug, according to the CDC, and these are older figures and have actually increased more recently over the last month, is around 50%. And if we look at 3 or 5 medications, so what we call polypharmacy, which is 5 or more medications, it also is pretty significant as well, around 12.8% of the population. If we look at more vulnerable populations like older adults, this number is also very large, and there's disproportionate impacts in terms of folks who are Black or Hispanic who are taking multiple medications as well because of their disproportionate burden of disease. So the impact on the FDA is fairly large, but has a particular impact on our most vulnerable communities and communities of color. FDA is really in the background on the practice of medicine. Even though obviously it plays such a huge role, we oftentimes when we're in our clinical practice don't think about the FDA. It's assumed that when something is FDA approved, there's a gold standard that's been applied, that safety and efficacy has been established, that once a product's on the market, we're good to go in terms of being able to offer it to our patients. There's been rigorous scientific evaluation that's already been conducted, and we have assurance that whatever we're prescribing for our patients, whatever we're administering to our patients is safe and effective for the people that we're seeing in our clinics, in the exam rooms, in the hospitals. So the FDA has a huge role, obviously, on clinical practice, even though FDA, and I'll talk about this, says specifically they don't regulate the practice of medicine. They have kind of this overarching presence that we oftentimes don't think about on our day-to-day basis. So this is the mission statement of the FDA, and I just want to point out a couple of areas of tension that is within the mission statement, which is something that the FDA Task Force is grappling with in our advocacy generally. So FDA says they're responsible for protecting public health by assuring safety, efficacy, and security of a wide range of products, but including human and veterinary drugs, medical devices, amongst other things. In the late 1990s, FDA added other provisions or other parts of their mission statement by talking about their responsibility for advancing public health and helping to speed innovation that makes medicines more effective, safer, and more affordable. And I highlighted that and bolded it and italicized it because there's kind of like almost a balance that FDA has to walk. Yes, we want to ensure timely access, kind of fast access to new products, but at the same time, they're trying to do their due diligence by ensuring that these products are actually truly safe and effective. And that takes time to also do as well. So this is this sort of like a weird kind of crosswalk that we play as clinicians in relying on the FDA of having timely access to new products, but at the same time, making sure that they're taking enough time to actually make sure that these drugs are truly safe and affordable, safe and effective. FDA also plays a huge role in innovation by fostering the development of medical products. So by setting regulatory standards for approval for new medical products, they're actually setting the bar for innovation. So how, what sorts of drugs are going to come through the pipeline, what is going to be the standards for clinical trials for various products. They're the ones who are really setting kind of what, the R&D landscape looks like for new medical products before they come to the market. So critical role on access, on innovation, and also on safety and efficacy as well. And FDA's focus has changed over the years. It's oftentimes been reactionary to external events. So in the 1930s, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was established to actually allow the FDA to ensure the safety of medical products. So before this, you would have people cooking up things in their bathtub and directly selling it to patients, putting up ads for like heroin and cocaine and other sorts of kind of illicit products, and saying like this cures whatever illness that was affecting the day, and telling people that they should just trust them as an individual that this product will work. Quickly, it became realized that there were serious safety concerns around these products. Like, not only did we not know if it was actually effective, but whether or not like the same batch that was being cooked up in somebody's kitchen or in their bathtub whether or not there was actually assurance that it would be the same product each time. So FDA was established under the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to initially provide just safety assurance about new products before they came to market. Then in the 60s, after what happened with thalidomide, which was a drug that was approved in Europe and in some other countries and not in the United States for treatment of nausea in pregnant people, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment was established because it was quickly realized that there were side effects from this, and the effect of the drug was actually not purported or not actually had not been established. And so some scientists here in the US FDA were looking at case reports in Europe and said, okay, we not only need to look at safety, but we also need to look at efficacy. Is what the sponsor, the pharmaceutical company, whoever's trying to sell this product and get it on the market, what are they claiming that this is going to be a cure for, whatever they're claiming that this is going to treat, is that actually true? So that's when safety and efficacy got established in the 1960s. After that, we saw an emphasis on speed, and this is for particular sets of products. So creating incentives for innovation to be able to bring new products for diseases of unmet need, diseases that were very serious, affecting vulnerable populations to the market. So in the 80s, we had the Orphan Act, which actually established the Orphan Drug Act, incentives for rare disease drugs, so diseases that treat populations that are 200,000 people in the US or less in the US. And the 1983 Orphan Drug Act included a number of R&D incentives, including priority review, so faster review of new medical products, 7 years of market exclusivity once drugs came onto the market, so a monopoly period that was extended for products that were for rare diseases, and then also tax credits and tax benefits as well. Then after that, we had the Hatch-Waxman Act, which actually allowed timely access to generic products onto the market, accelerated approval, which I'll talk a little bit later, that also created a different pathway for drugs based on new endpoints that were going to be easier and faster to be able to measure. And then we had user fee reauthorization. So essentially a funding mechanism for the FDA, but with that came a lot of emphasis on speed and creating new pathways of approval for different products. And then after that, 21st Century Cures, which was in 2016, a huge bill that included various sorts of other innovation incentives, regulatory incentives to get new products on the market faster. So you can see in kind of reaction to various events that have happened, we've had a shift from safety, safety and efficacy, and now safety, efficacy, and speed. And that mirrors FDA's mission that I had in previous slides. So, what does the FDA do? What does this all mean? FDA approves drugs, devices, and other medical products as safe and effective for conditions of use prescribed or suggested within the drug label. So it's for a particular indication. Drugs aren't approved as a drug by itself. It's a drug that's for a particular indication that FDA has determined is safe and effective for. It's for a specific population. So oftentimes you'll see, we will authorize market approval for this new drug for whatever indication in adults, 18 or older, or for a population that's 12 years or older. And then they also have specific dose and duration for the particular drug product or even device that before they come onto the market as well. There's a burden on the sponsors to actually provide evidence that the drug is safe and effective. So the FDA doesn't solicit or say we want to have we're gonna like do the work for you around, looking at clinical trials outside of what you submit to us, that the product is safe and effective. The sponsor it's their responsibility to actually provide that sort of evidence that the drug is safe and effective for that particular use within the application. And FDA also issues guidances to sponsors regarding standards for regulatory review. So they actually set guidelines for, okay, this is how we're thinking that we're going to set the bar for regulatory approval around safety and efficacy. And this gives sponsors kind of insight in terms of how they're thinking about new product approval. So what does FDA also do, and what do they not do? So they do regulate, what drug companies can advertise and sell. So they play a key role in market authorization. They regulate interstate commerce, so things that are crossing across state lines under the Commerce Act. But they do not regulate what we prescribe in clinical practice. We can prescribe things that are off-label, so it's not an FDA-approved indication for a particular drug. We actually have state licensing boards that play more responsibility around prescribing practice. We also there's also a difference between off-label use and off-label promotion. So FDA does regulate the promotional side of off-label use, and there's been kind of various challenges to that under free speech that's happened in the courts. So FDA's authority on that has also been mixed. But just generally, FDA does not regulate how we actually prescribe things in practice. Like theoretically, we could prescribe a drug for something that FDA there's no clinical trial for, that we just think might work. And this happens kind of all the time in clinical practice, unfortunately. What they also do is that they make experimental drugs available outside of clinical trials through expanded access. So if there is someone who has a fatal disease, and this oftentimes happens in like neonatal populations or in rare disease populations, and that drug is just not available yet through FDA approval, FDA will also create like expanded access pathways so that someone can get the drug outside of a clinical trial. And that's the kind of distinction that FDA has between approval and access. So they do have avenues for those populations to actually be able to try those new drugs. It's just not going to come through FDA approval, and there's not going to be that gold stamp saying that the drug has been proven to be safe and effective for that particular use. What they don't do is that they don't approve protocols as a part of the development. So when a sponsor comes to them with like a clinical trial design and a protocol, they don't necessarily provide oversight in terms of, we're going to sign off on this protocol before you do the clinical trial. Oftentimes the sponsors will just do the clinical trial, and then they'll present the data to the FDA, and then FDA will make a determination, okay, based on their study, based on the results, we're going to decide if we're going to approve this or not. So it's usually after the fact. And the only time they also put a hold is if there's safety concerns. So how is FDA funded? Obviously, FDA has a lot of responsibility, not just drugs, not just devices, foods, cosmetics, supplements. So how do they actually do all this stuff? And so until 1992, they were funded through congressional appropriations, so taxpayer funding. But then in 1992, when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was occurring, there was a lot of concern that the FDA was being too slow in terms of approving new HIV/AIDS medications or antiretroviral therapy. And as a result of that, PDUFA was born, or the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. What this does is that it allows drug sponsors to pay a fee along with their application, usually now a few million per application, that will help to fund FDA staff that will review their application. So essentially, FDA will take that funding, they'll earmark it for particular purposes for reviewing applications, and that will be able to allow them to hire more staff. FDA's user fee budget has expanded greatly, and I'll show some slides around that. And so they're heavily reliant, increasingly so, especially as drug development has sped up. We're having more and more drug applications coming to the FDA. FDA is more and more relying on these user fees to be able to support their regulatory review activities. The odd thing about this, though, is that FDA negotiates with drug sponsors how they're going to use the fees. So every 5 years when the user fee bill gets reauthorized, a few years before that, FDA's meetings with drug companies and also medical device companies and other sorts of companies of products that they regulate that they get user fees for, and they go back and forth in terms of what the user fees will be used for. And this happens behind closed doors and is a whole separate kind of ecosystem in which FDA has kind of very non-transparent, frankly, negotiations with the sponsor. So you can imagine what the commitments that FDA promises to uphold and using the user fees will look like, oftentimes driven with what the drug company wants versus what our public health or public stakeholder needs. FDA does have a separate venue for public stakeholders, but there's huge discrepancy in terms of the number of meetings between the two. There's like hundreds of meetings or over 100 meetings with drug company sponsors in a given user fee cycle, and usually about a handful with public stakeholders. And the public stakeholders are oftentimes organizations that are funded by industry. So usually they're just reflecting what the companies are also saying, just in a different venue. So it's kind of compounding the issue in terms of what is user fees being used for? Is it for public health needs or patient needs, or is it for what drug companies want the user fees to be used for? So this is just to show just how much user fees have increased substantially, and these are across all the user fee agreements, so not just for drugs, for medical devices, biologics, tobacco, and others, and it's increased pretty substantially. FDA has now, for their upcoming budget, has asked for $7 billion as a part of their budget, with about about half, 3.2, I think, coming from congressional appropriations, and then the rest, about 3.7, coming from user fees. So user fees are oftentimes outpacing now what we're actually seeing from congressional appropriations to be able to meet the responsibility of regulatory review for so many products. And this, again, creates a sort of weird dynamic in which FDA is beholden to the industry that they're supposed to be regulating. And we're actually seeing evidence of this. So this is a study that was done by a group at Memorial Sloan Kettering that looked at user fee agreements over the years. And these are like the number of provisions that pharma had been pushing for as a part of the user fee negotiations with each cycle. And you can see it's actually kind of increased substantially over time. But looking specifically at what the provisions that they were pushing for, it's clear that the priorities from the pharmaceutical companies was increased interaction with the FDA, so having more closed-door meetings with the FDA when their product is being developed and reviewed. So you can imagine what sorts of conflicts of interest this might create with the agency. Also, having more and more expedited review pathways, lowering regulatory standards, so setting the bar for approval lower, and then also allowing for the user fee scope to be used mostly in the pre-market setting, so only before approval in terms of how products get onto the market, and much less on the post-market space in terms of surveillance, like for safety or making sure that there's confirmation of clinical benefit. So a pretty dramatic sort of shift. So what does this mean, though, just generally in terms of drugs that we're seeing coming to the market? This is a study that our group had done looking at trends in expedited or special regulatory review pathways. So FDA has adopted over time with the PDUFAs various sorts of expedited review pathways, shortening the time for reviewing a drug from 10 months to 6 months, or sometimes even less, allowing for different endpoints that are easier to measure, but not necessarily associated with how patients feel, function, or survive to be the standard for approval, or sometimes even allowing for increased interaction as the drug is being developed and reviewed with the FDA along the way. And just to point out here, what this slide actually shows, this slide actually shows that the number over time, this is the 1990s, these are the early 2000s, and this is the mid-aughts. Over time, FDA's kind of designation of of expedited or special regulatory review pathways has actually been applied increasingly so to drugs as time has gone on. So more and more drugs are using these user fee pathways. About 2/3 of every new drug that comes onto the market has some sort of special expedited review program or a special regulatory pathway applied to it, which means more regulatory incentives to come to the market, lower regulatory standards, and faster approval. So on top of that, the other concern that's come up is that usually in a clinical trial, you have a drug that's being tested against a placebo or a comparator, so you can actually know, hey, is this drug better than nothing, or is this drug better than like what we usually take that's on the market? And increasingly so, what we're seeing is that FDA is allowing for single group studies, so a drug not being compared to anything. Basically, you just have a group of patients that are all taking the drug and just seeing what the effect is within that group over time, so not being able to make comparisons. And FDA has, over time, increasingly allowed for that to happen. On top of that, trials have also become shorter in terms of duration. So over time, the trials are usually 6 months or 12 months, even for chronic disease drugs. So drugs that people might take for the rest of their life or indefinitely into their older age. And we just don't know what the effects might be long term because the drugs are not studied for that period of time. Usually they're fairly short trials instead. On top of that, FDA, the standard for substantial evidence of effectiveness, which is the statutory language for how FDA needs to determine efficacy. And in the statute, it actually says adequate and well-controlled investigations, plural. That got changed over time to actually allow more flexibility. in terms of what FDA will allow as the standard for approval. So initially it was at least 2 trials, and you can imagine, from the kind of like the tenets of science, if you do a study once, you want to do it again to make sure that the results are reproducible. Instead, FDA over time is actually allowing for a single study to be the basis of approval instead of 2 studies. So we don't know if there's another study that's done that's kind of exactly the same, whether or not the results would be the same or not. And about a majority of the drugs actually this past year were all based on single pivotal trials instead of 2 adequate and well-controlled investigations. And FDA has put out a guidance now about like what the flexibility will look like what other sort of evidence they would allow in addition to a single trial. And sometimes it's real-world evidence, so stuff that's observational data from claims data or electronic health records or registries, which you won't be able to tell compared to another drug, how effective the drug is or how safe the drug is, where there's a lot of confounding sort of factors that might obscure the results. FDA is now going to be allowing a single trial in addition to this weaker form of evidence called confirmatory evidence as the basis of approval, and we're seeing that in real time as well. So that brings me to kind of just one of the expedited review pathways that the DFA FDA task force is focused on, which is accelerated approval. And accelerated approval is this idea that we're going to allow for earlier market access based on a reasonably likely surrogate endpoint. So it's not a surrogate endpoint that's been proven for sure to actually have an association with how patients feel, function, or survive. It's just thought to be reasonably likely that they might predict this. So FDA will allow approval based on this, as long as this company that's getting the approval promises and commits to actually completing a required post-approval study to confirm clinical benefit. So they're supposed to do a study afterwards that actually measures how patients feel, function, survive to actually prove that the surrogate endpoint actually does predict this. And so that's a promise that's made under accelerated approval, but we've seen issues with that over time. On top of that, I mentioned before that accelerated approval was initially established for speeding up access to HIV/AIDS medications. Now, the majority of drugs that have actually gotten accelerated approval are in the oncology space, so in the cancer space. I think it was like 85% over in the last decade of accelerated approvals are all like oncology medications. We've also seen kind of an expansion of accelerated approval outside of that as well. So we're seeing this with non-oncology rare diseases. And in fact, the head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research, one of the centers within the FDA, has said specifically that accelerated approval will be the go-to pathway for rare disease drugs. And this includes like gene therapies as well, and then for Alzheimer's disease. And I think folks are well aware of what happened with aducanumab and also lecanemab, but this has now become the pathway of choice for these drugs. So a much broader patient population being affected by accelerated approval. So the question becomes, okay, if you approve things like accelerated approval, at least there's a commitment to confirm clinical benefit. Like, what are the types of drugs that you're approving through accelerated approval? Are they actually like therapeutically beneficial? And thankfully, we have comparative studies because other countries around the world actually evaluate therapeutic benefit. They actually look at the therapeutic value of new drugs. And you can see here, this is a study that compared the FDA to the EMA. And just kind of long story short, when they looked at the number of drugs that came through accelerated approval versus EMA's version of this, FDA approved many, many more drugs compared to the EMA under this pathway of kind of a lower standard of evidence, faster approval. And then on top of that, when they compared the drugs that were approved through these 2 different pathways in the FDA and EMA, they actually found that very few of the drugs that were approved through the FDA accelerated approval pathway were of high therapeutic benefit. So not a lot of benefit for patients from a clinical perspective. And the EMA did slightly better on this. But for oncology, for cancer in particular, when drugs have gone through these sort of faster pathways, only about 1/3 of the drugs actually showed any significant, like moderate or high therapeutic benefit. So patients are, they're essentially, getting drugs where we're either not sure of the clinical benefit or it might be low clinical benefit for them. And they're getting access to them faster. All that's fine. These are the drugs that are coming through the pathway. We'll accept, some uncertainty around efficacy. But the expectation is that the sponsor will then complete a post-approval study to actually confirm clinical benefit. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is significant delays in post-approval confirmatory trial completion. And this was a study that was done by the British Medical Journal in 2021 that actually looked at all accelerated approval drugs that were approved by the FDA between 1992 and 2020 and found that about 112 out of 253 of them did not have any confirmation of clinical benefit. So that's a significant portion of those drugs. And then 16 of those drugs had been withdrawn. So there was a study that was done, did not show confirmation of clinical benefit, and thankfully they were either withdrawn voluntarily by the sponsor more often than not, or the FDA withdrew them from the market. But you can see 112 out of 253, we just still don't know what's going on. 24 have been on the market for 5 years or more. So that means patients have drugs where it's uncertain what the clinical benefit is and have been taking them or been exposed to them for long periods of time while remaining on the market. The BMJ, to their credit, contacted the manufacturers to see, okay, what's going on? Why have 24 of these drugs been on the market for 5 or more years and no study been done to actually confirm clinical benefit? They got no response from about half of them, which is also appalling. But 6 of them, after they contacted them, actually withdrew their drugs or said that they had their study postponed as well. 6 manufacturers did provide information about the trials, and 4 of them said they just started recruitment, so they just started to enroll people into their studies 5 years later after the drug had gone on the market, and then 2 of them were still discussing trial design, so they hadn't even started recruiting people to their trials. So that's a significant number of drugs in which patients, and these are for usually oncology indications, or patients have cancer, they're hoping that these drugs will be working for them, but we have no idea if there's actually going to be a clinical benefit, and sponsors are not really being motivated to actually do the studies to actually confirm that they work. This is just another study just showing delays in confirmatory trial completion. These are just the number of studies that are late that you can see here. This dark blue bar right here is how many of them have not been fulfilled. So they had a deadline, they went past the deadline, and they have not fulfilled the deadline for completing their confirmatory trials. And a very small proportion of them have been withdrawn. Anyways. So this is the other thing I just wanted to point out. We did a study just to look at duration of the post-approval studies, because sponsors sometimes will say, oh, but the post-approval studies take a long time, longer than what the FDA tells us in terms of the deadlines. We actually looked at this, and we found that actually overall, post-approval studies are pretty much on par in terms of duration as their pre-market studies, so the studies that got them approval in the first place, and it's about 17 months. So not too bad to actually get them. And FDA sets a generous deadline typically, so they actually give them a deadline that's usually 44 months, so well past that. So they give them a lot of leeway in terms of completing the confirmatory trial. So there's not really an excuse for them not to complete these studies on time. The other thing I just wanted to point out is that, remember, the confirmatory studies are supposed to look at clinical benefit, right? They're supposed to confirm that the patients function, feel, survive better. But overwhelmingly, what we're seeing in the confirmatory studies, so this is a surrogate endpoint, this is clinical endpoint, these are post-approval studies. Out of our analysis of 38 drugs, 19 of them use surrogate endpoints as their main endpoint for the confirmatory study. So instead of studying, does this drug actually work, they're looking at a surrogate endpoint where we're not going to be sure that there's a clinical benefit for the drug. This is a study that's looking at what does this mean in terms of federal spending. Okay, so we're thinking about obviously patients that are paying for these drugs, but so is the federal government, and especially Medicare and Medicaid are spending quite a bit of money on these accelerated approval drugs, typically cancer drugs that they have to cover, typically biologic drugs that are very expensive, administered under Medicare Part B, and we actually want to look at what does spending look like. So we looked at drugs that have been approved through accelerated approval between 2012 and 2017. There was 38 drugs within this time that were approved under accelerated approval. CMS spent between Medicare and Medicaid about $70 billion on these drugs, for approval. And then we looked further to see, okay, based on if the drug was converted or not, to traditional approval. So there was a study that was done. It actually confirmed clinical benefit. How much did CMS actually spend at that point? When the study was not converted, around $50 billion was spent by CMS on those drugs. And then if it was based on a surrogate endpoint, we saw about $900 million being spent by CMS on these drugs where we just didn't know if there was actually a clinical benefit. So a significant portion of spending by CMS on these drugs where we still don't know if there's actually a benefit for patients for these drugs. And there might be a potential lever from a payer to say like, okay, we're not going to cover this drug or we're going to pay you less until you actually confirm clinical benefit. And that's something that CMS is currently piloting right now or trying to. The other question that comes up is like, okay, clinical trials are super hard to do. This is what companies say all the time. After approval, let's use real world evidence. And our group actually looked at this to see whether or not can you use real world evidence to actually replicate or do confirmatory studies after you get accelerated approval to confirm clinical benefit. And looking at about 50 drugs that have been approved through the accelerated approval pathway, they try to see if they could use electronic health record data or claims data to be able to replicate those clinical trials to confirm clinical benefit, and none of them could be replicated using real world evidence. So that just shows you that we need to have a clinical trial to actually confirm clinical benefit, especially for accelerated approval drugs, to confirm that they actually work for our patients. Just this has all culminated, all this concerns around accelerated approval has thankfully culminated to a lot of attention around this pathway and the need for there to be a better FDA oversight of this promise that sponsors have made to actually complete their confirmatory studies. And this, with this most recent PDUFA cycle, accelerated approval reforms are on the table. There's a lot of attention around this. A lot of the research that I showed was kind of highlighted in different op-eds. And that kind of got the attention of Congress. And that led to what we see now, which are accelerated approval reforms that were passed in late 2022 as a part of the Food Drug Omnibus Reform Act. They were initially a part of PDUFA. It didn't get in PDUFA because they wanted a clean bill, but then got it in later in the Omnibus Reform Bill. What does the bill do? It actually increases FDA oversight over confirmatory trials by requiring FDA to actually oversee the design of the studies. So instead of having sponsors do whatever study they want using a surrogate endpoint, setting whatever sort of clinical trial design that they want, FDA will actually play a proactive role in making sure the studies are actually confirming clinical benefit, actually have a comparison group, are appropriate for actually showing that the drugs actually work. They also require the confirmatory study to be underway at the time of approval. So FDA is actually taking steps to say that at the time of approval or within a short period of time after approval, the sponsor actually has to make sure that the study is fully enrolled and starting before they actually give accelerated approval. FDA has already exercised this like right before this bill was passed, and they're increasingly doing so now that they have these authorities, which is great because this prevents delays in terms of confirmatory trials being completed. They also require the sponsor, very importantly, to submit regular progress reports on their confirmatory trial status. So every 6 months, the sponsor is supposed to tell the FDA, hey, our study is going well, or it's delayed for this reason, and then FDA can have a conversation early on to kind of prevent further delays from occurring. They outline specific processes for withdrawal of unproven accelerated approval drugs. So before, FDA was heavily reliant on voluntary withdrawal. They would have to try to convince a sponsor, hey, take the drug off the market. Sponsors sometimes would comply, but sometimes would not. And this would lead to a lengthy arbitration process. We saw this with McKenna for the prevention of preterm birth. We saw this with Avastin for breast cancer. But now FDA has been able to say, here's the specific process for withdrawal if your trial is negative. If your drug does not work, this is what we're going to do. They also consider the lack of completion of progress reports or the confirmatory trial to be a prohibited act. So that means they can levy penalties on the company, even take them to court potentially to sue them. So now having more enforcement action. And they also create an accelerated approval council, which is basically all the center directors coming together across disease areas to talk about accelerated approval generally. What it doesn't include is this automatic expiration, like in Europe and other countries, of unconfirmed accelerated approval drugs. So if a company takes forever to actually complete their study in other countries, there's an expiration date. So if the sponsor doesn't complete the study within a few years' time, then in other countries they can actually take the drug off the market. The FDA, that was proposed here initially as a part of the bill, it didn't pass, unfortunately. And there's not clear requirements for labeling. So in guidance, FDA has said, and this is guidance is our non-binding recommendation, so it's not a requirement, but in guidance, FDA has said, we want sponsors to say very clearly on the drug label that this drug has been approved under accelerated approval, confirmation of clinical benefits still pending, the approval is based on a surrogate endpoint. And there was a study done to see, okay, are sponsors doing this across all their drug labels for accelerated approval drugs? And about 13% of them were not disclosing on the drug label that they had undergone accelerated approval. So the proposal was a requirement for universal labeling, and unfortunately that didn't pass as well. The couple of things that we're looking out for that the DFA FDA task force has been working on is, this continued use of accelerated approval as a rescue pathway. So we're seeing oftentimes trials designed not intended for accelerated approval. So they usually have a clinical outcome that's a primary outcome. And then it fails that clinical outcome, but then there happens to be a secondary outcome that's a surrogate endpoint. And then FDA says like, okay, why don't we look at this as at this endpoint specifically and say, well, we'll approve this under accelerated approval. This is happening with ALS drugs and Alzheimer's drugs. So lecanemab, when it was approved under accelerated approval, it actually failed its clinical endpoints, which was its primary endpoint, but it had a secondary endpoint, which is beta amyloid, a surrogate endpoint, and that became the basis of its accelerated approval. So in effect, it's a rescue pathway for drugs that would otherwise not see the market. The enforcement discretion in the bill is left in the hands of the FDA. So a lot of the bill language says the FDA may do this sort of enforcement action, but not shall, so it doesn't require them to, so they can have more leeway and flexibility in applying it. There's an unclear evaluation process of success and unclear validation process for surrogate endpoints. So we have a bunch of surrogate endpoints that are FDA is considering or have been the basis of approval, but we don't know whether or not there's been ongoing investigation about, does a surrogate endpoint actually predict clinical benefit? Like, is FDA doing those studies or requiring those studies to actually happen? And so we're not seeing any sort of clear validation process for that. And what's complicating matters now also is that there's an ongoing effort to reform advisory committees at the FDA. So the potential for there not to be product-specific advisory committees, the potential for advisory committees to be called for less, all of those kind of compound this issue that the FDA might employ a lot of flexibility without a lot of oversight and accountability to other parties. I'll just say really quickly here, we talked about accelerated approval a lot, but uncertainty it also exists outside of accelerated approval. FDA uses a lot of flexibility outside of that pathway as well. And accelerated approval has some sort of protection at least because there's an off-ramp. Like if they don't do the study after approval, FDA can withdraw from the market. When things are approved through a traditional pathway, there's not that sort of off-ramp that's built in. There's no requirement that says like you need to do an additional study to confirm benefit, and if you don't do this, we're going to take it off the market. Although FDA theoretically can, but they usually have not exercised that. It's very difficult to withdraw drugs off the market otherwise. So we did a study of just looking at 3 years of approvals and found that about 10% of drugs that were approved during this period of time didn't meet their primary endpoint. So they basically failed their clinical trials by their primary endpoints. They were approved for other reasons. They were approved because they addressed a secondary endpoints. I mentioned before that trials have different endpoints, but they said, okay, we'll base the approval off the secondary endpoint. Sometimes they base it off of other studies that they see outside of pivotal trials. There's various reasons for why they do this. But one thing that I thought was pretty surprising here is that for the drugs that missed their primary endpoints, there's this question like, okay, does the drug actually work? And you would think that would be the point that FDA says, we're going to call an external advisory committee. We're going to have independent experts come together to tell us like, hey, should we approve this drug or not, despite the trial essentially failing. And you'll see for a majority of them, an advisory committee was not called. So they didn't rely on external experts to make that determination. On top of that, very few of the drugs that actually missed their primary endpoints actually had a post-marketing requirement, so an additional study requirement that would actually address that missed endpoint. So to say like, okay, you missed the endpoint on this study, we're going to require another study to actually show that the drug actually works for the endpoint that you missed. But very few, a minority of the drugs actually do that. So FDA, as I mentioned before, is employing like this idea of regulatory flexibility. This is actually a drug that has now hit the news more recently for ALS called Relyvrio. The drug here was approved based on a phase 2 study under traditional approval, despite there being not a lot of evidence of kind of meaningful clinical benefit for patients. The drug got on the market, and when they had the advisory committee meeting before the approval, the FDA official turned over to the CEOs and said, hey, you're doing a phase 3 study now, which is typically kind of the last study you do before approval. And if that phase 3 study is negative, you promise, right, to like take the drug off the market. Basically like asking the company CEOs, like, will you do the right thing if the study turns out to be negative? It was a very odd sort of exchange because they're being very reliant on the CEOs kind of doing the right thing, being voluntary in terms of withdrawing the drug off the market should the study be negative. Turns out the study turned out to be negative. So patients were taking this, they did a clinical trial, they did the phase 3 study. they put out the results to their credit. The study turned out to be negative. And now the CEOs are sort of talking about withdrawing the drug from the market, but we haven't seen any sort of clear action. And FDA is continuing to rely on the company to take timely action. And they said if the company doesn't do so, then they'll have to look at their options for withdrawing the drug off the market. So this is kind of a case of regulatory flexibility. And for me, this just highlights a lot of concerns that you have a company that you're like, that the FDA is reliant on to do the right thing, instead of the FDA acting as a regulator and taking the drug off the market, despite it clearly failing. So it's been an interesting view to see. All that to say is that our view has been that when there's regulatory flexibility being applied to new drugs before approval, FDA has the authority to actually require additional post-market studies. They can and they should do this to be able to meet the uncertainty that happens ahead of approval. We need to have some sort of timely confirmation that these drugs actually work after they hit the market and within a period of time. And if FDA doesn't require this, what incentive does a company have to show that their drug potentially doesn't work? And so without FDA actually requiring this, these studies are not going to happen. So it's just more about basically making sure that in order to meet regulatory flexibility, we need to have post-market evidence to match it. So just to say, all this, what really matters at the end of the day is like, okay, what do our patients want? What do consumers want? What do even clinicians want? And there's been various polls over time to show that they want, about 60% of people have said that they oppose efforts that government standards should be changing to make drug approval faster, I was actually quite surprised by this. There's a lot of the rhetoric has been around timely access and faster access, but when the question was asked, like, do you want regulatory approval standards to change to enable that, majority of people said no. And then whether or not the government should just accept drugs approved in other countries, this has been a proposal that's been on the table, kind of this idea of harmonization between countries. And 70% of people in the United States at least said no, they would be opposed to that, which is interesting. And especially because FDA is considered to be the gold standard. We're one of the few agencies in the world that actually looks at individual participant data. So usually other countries will look at kind of published clinical trials or summary data. We actually rerun the analyses for clinical trials to actually prove that the drugs are safe and effective. So this is why we're considered the gold standard of the world. There's this other sort of a conundrum that we're seeing of like the impact of like lobbying and conflicts of interest on legislation. So, obviously we're as Doctors for America, we're oftentimes one of the few voices in the room that's not funded by the medical device industry, that's not funded by the pharmaceutical industry, talking about stronger regulatory standards. And the other side, which talks about kind of making regulatory standards lower or more flexible, when we kind of dig into the details, oftentimes see conflicts of interest and that influencing legislation to go faster and faster at the expense of the FDA. So there's kind of this sort of interesting interaction that the effects of these lobbying and conflict of interest might have an impact on what legislation's on the table, but in terms of public opinion, people want to have strong regulatory standards. They want things that are safe and effective. All these concerning things that I just told you about is what led to the FDA task force. So it initially started about a decade ago through the National Physicians Alliance before it merged with Doctors for America. NPA brought together clinicians just on a volunteer basis across different specialties to work on issues related to FDA regulatory policy, just being concerned that there wasn't an independent clinician voice, a counterweight in the room in these conversations around regulatory standards for approval, getting new drugs to market, new medical products to market just generally. And the idea of making sure that our patients get access to not the most, they get timely access, but they don't get timely access to products that are truly safe and effective. And where we have reasonable reassurance and when we're prescribing things, we also know that it's safe and effective as well at the time of approval. In 2021, there was an inflection point that I think led to the resurgence of the FDA task force, which was the approval of aducanumab for Alzheimer's disease. So this was a drug that was indicated for treatment of early Alzheimer's disease, went through a highly unusual approval process, won a lot of industry interaction with the FDA, kind of reanalyzing the data where they had one study that was positive, one study was negative. So again, when we have adequate and well-controlled investigations, usually you have two studies that show the same thing. In this case, you had one study showing one positive thing and another study showing a negative thing. And this is rerunning the prior data that was negative in the first place. Then after that, using accelerated approval as a rescue pathway for approval. So after having external advisors come in and say almost unanimously they shouldn't approve the drug based on this new analysis, FDA going back to the drawing table with the company and saying like, okay, we're going to instead use this unvalidated surrogate endpoint called beta amyloid, just what you see kind of lit up in the brain. It's an imaging sort of change that's not been proven to be associated with a clinical outcome like improvement in Alzheimer's disease or progression of Alzheimer's disease, and instead say we're going to prove it based on this beta amyloid and give it accelerated approval. And I think this sent like shockwaves through clinicians across the country because we were getting questions from our patients immediately saying like, hey, there's a new drug for Alzheimer's disease. Everyone knows someone who's affected by Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's dementia. And so a lot of questions came before us in the exam room, in the hospital, in the clinic, asking us about this new drug and kind of being at a loss of like what to do in terms of how to communicate with our patients. And especially, not just from an efficacy perspective, but a safety perspective. Patients who were taking this drug, who were in the trials, had brain swelling, brain bleeding, and then later on was found to have death as a result of the drug. So this became kind of the big impetus for saying like something needs to change at the FDA, that there needs to be an independent voice of clinicians who are at the front lines, who are talking to patients about these drugs, that we can have reassurance and certainty that these drugs actually work before they come to the market. So our theory of change for the FDA task force has been, one, to educate clinicians across the country around FDA approval standards, how the FDA works, and looking at ways we can actually improve the FDA approval process. Then together advocate for better regulatory standards for approval and making sure that that the FDA's processes are centered around patients and public health and not on what industry wants in terms of faster approvals, and then mobilizing all of us together, but also with other organizations, including other medical professional societies, to be able to advocate together on these stronger regulatory standards that are centered around our patients and public health. And I'm going to turn over to Terryn now to talk about kind of the different things that the FDA task force has done.
So we've been able to do a lot in the 2 years that we have existed. One of the examples of the task force's growth has been our ability to convene meetings with different people in the field and educate them, and also educate our wider audience about why the FDA is so important to our clinicians' work. So this is just one example of fireside chats on timely issues. Reshma convened a fireside chat with energy and representatives from the Energy and Oversight committees, their staff, about the investigation on the Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm, just to hear more about their process for that investigation. We also do regular advocacy grand rounds, which are CME events for our membership, and we bring both folks who are part of the FDA task force in to talk about their work. This one we had Dr. Andrew Kolodny speak about opioid considerations for the opioid crisis and how the FDA interacts with that. So we really use these advocacy grand rounds events to educate our folks, but also educate a broader audience about the different ways that the FDA interacts with our clinicians and their work. One of the biggest ways that we engage folks is through fly-ins to Washington, D.C. It started out small. First, we were just going to Capitol Hill to introduce ourselves and also educate legislators and other leadership about the FDA, the DFA FDA task force, what's important to us, and it has expanded and grown. We come each quarter. We've continued to build relationships across DC. And this is one of our most recent fly-ins. We were able to meet with the chief scientist of the FDA. We've had meetings with CMS and a number of large organizations and leaders to just educate them about what we're finding in our work. Again, we have met with CMS to express our support for their national coverage determination. A lot of things have changed since we've had this meeting, but I think one of the biggest things that we take away from our meetings with regulatory bodies and leadership is just to continue to build that relationship, because we are often the only group that is nonprofit, nonpartisan in the room. Often when we come onto the Hill, you have a lot of different groups that are coming in that are sponsored by different entities, but we are nonprofit, nonpartisan, and they really appreciate hearing from doctors themselves in white coats. And again, we are in the offices. We're actually headed out today to meet with some offices, to meet with staff and also congressional leaders about the range of issues that we cover through the FDA task force. Another way that we engage our task force members is through public testimony. A lot of times doctors may not know, when they hear about kind of some of the challenges facing the FDA, they don't know how to make an impact. And one way that we do that with our group is through public testimony, and that means signing up for advisory committee meetings which the FDA hosts to hear from experts on different things, on different drugs and things of that nature. So we train our doctors to go to these advisory committee meetings and share their feedback with the committee. It's a public meeting. We enter comments into the public register as well, just so they know that we are here, we are watching and listening, and we want our voice to be heard in these matters, because a lot of times, again, they don't hear from folks who are outside of industry. So we, aside from public testimony, we submit comments, go to meetings, we're showing up in as many places as we can to let them know that we're here and we're watching. So we also have had a quite important role in some of the health justice issues that have come up in the past few years. We've submitted, I think it's over 4 now, probably 5, yeah. 5 amicus briefs into the Supreme Court, Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, sorry. Versus the FDA. And the reason why we felt it was so important to engage with this case, and it centers around mifepristone, which is an abortion care drug. And the reason why we felt it was so important to engage is because not just because it has to deal with reproductive health, but also because it really impacts the FDA's authority and ability to do its job well. And we're working on a state preemption brief. We've been cited by a number of high-profile folks out there, so like DOJ, folks in Congress are really watching, because again, our physicians are telling their stories from the ground about why this care is important and why undermining the FDA could be disastrous for their patients. So I think that is the end of our presentation for today. But this is just an overview of how we are able to do our work and how far we've come in the 2.5 years since the task force has been reinvigorated.